welcome to the Talk About Teddy podcast, our conversations exploring the world of Theodore Roosevelt. I'm your host, Kurt Skinner, and I'm joined, as ever, by my friend and co-host, Larry Marple. Hey, we're talking about the Rough Riders again, Larry.
Yes, and we've had a really terrific response to our discussion with Mark Lee Gardner back on episode 2 when we talked with him about his book, The Rough Riders.
Yeah, so we're excited to be able to revisit Roosevelt's Spanish-American War Regiment today as we welcome Clay Risen to the podcast to discuss his book, The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, The Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century. So, Larry, what can you tell our listeners about Clay?
Well, Clay Risen is a graduate of the Georgetown School of Foreign Service and of the University of Chicago. He's a New York Times journalist and the author of 4 acclaimed books on 20th century American history. They include the just-released book, Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. In addition to his historical writing, he's also a best-selling author of 5 books on whiskey, bourbon, and rye, and believe it or not, is considered a leading authority on the American spirit industry. But the focus of our talk today with Clay is to discuss his award-winning 2019 book, The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, The Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century.
Okay, Clay Risen, welcome to the Talk About Teddy podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.
We're glad to have you with us today.
We really appreciate you carving time out of your schedule. It sounds kind of like You've got your own crowded hour right now. You have. So this is we're recording this in early March 2025, and you've got the release of a new book this month, right?
That's right. Yeah, it's called Red Scare, Blacklists, McCarthyism, and the Making of Modern America. So basically history of the Red Scare period after World War II.
Yeah. Maybe a couple of timely themes there.
Well, I didn't set out to write a current events book, but I'm just joking. It's a history book, but people can take from it what they will.
All right. Well, the real purpose of our conversation here today to have you on is to talk about your 2019 book, The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, The Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century. I should note this was a New York Times notable book of 2019, and also it was a finalist for the Gilder Lehrman Prize in Military History. So
that's right.
Belated congratulations there.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
So, Clay, you're a journalist, an editor, New York Times. You've written a lot about American political and social history, especially the Civil Rights era. You are leading authority on distilled spirits.
That's what they tell me.
I'm not sure how much TR would have to contribute to that conversation.
No, people always ask, well, there's obviously a tie-in there, right? No, TR was not much of an imbiber. And, maybe certainly some of the guys with him in Cuba, but he himself was pretty straight and narrow when it came to the distilled spirits.
Yeah, we were thinking it might make an interesting episode to talk about the trial that Roosevelt went to defend his
trial.
honor.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good information in the testimony there of his drinking habits, or you could say lack thereof. But
yeah, but I respect that. I mean, the one connection I will say is he, as part of the Pure Food and Drug Act, he had been lobbied very hard, and there's a strong case to be made about including a definition of whiskey, and he very much agreed with the man who was sort of the predecessor of the FDA commissioner. They didn't have the FDA at the time, but Harvey Wiley, and he pushed pretty hard for the idea that whiskey needs to be essentially aged, and it has to meet certain purity standards, because before that, whiskey could be really anything. So, even though TR didn't drink much himself, he had a huge impact on the history of distilled spirits in America, at least when it comes to federal regulations.
Yeah. Well, you've just prompted another layer of thought for us. So
another episode of the podcast.
There you go.
Excellent. Well, then the natural question is, Clay, how'd you become interested in Theodore Roosevelt in this volunteer regiment that he raised in this sort of obscure war at the end of the 1800s?
Well, I always preface these answers with the fact that as a journalist and as sort of I'm not an academic historian. I don't have to lay out a focus area or have a specialty. I can kind of pursue whatever interests me. And a lot of things that interest me go back to when I was a kid and just things that have stuck with me over time. And so when I was a kid, I grew up in Nashville, and my Boy Scout troop was Troop 92, the Rough Riders. And we had, all sorts of TR themed. I actually should have brought it with me,
That's great.
Knowing I was going to be on here, but I still have a lot of our gear. And, a great sort of cartoon TR and a slouch hat and big glasses. And, it sort of stuck in the back of my head. I knew who TR was, but I didn't know who the Rough Riders were. And it wasn't an abiding obsession of mine, but since I was a kid, I was sort of curious. Well, who were these guys? Yeah. And fast forward many years, and I was kind of I was poking around looking for a new book topic, and I happened across an obituary in the New York Times from the 30s, and it was for a Rough Rider. He had gone on to be a stockbroker, nothing really of significance. I mean, he did well for himself, but the headline and the thrust of the obit was, this is a guy who was a Rough Rider. And so it dawned on me that, well, here is something that 30 plus years later was enough to win a guy or to earn a guy an obituary in the New York Times, and for that to be the reason why he's in the New York Times. And so, it sort of jumped out. Well, I always thought of the story of the Rough Riders as this sort of interesting jaunt by Roosevelt, right? And that was basically what it was. And that's how a lot of the biographies of him treat it, right? It's important for his building his national career, or it says something about his personality, but that's about it. And so it struck me that, maybe there's a bigger story to be told here about the Rough Riders as a phenomenon and what the entire organization, the regiment, the fact that it came up when it did, the composition of the men who were in it, the popularity of the regiment, both during and after the war, that might actually say something bigger about American history. And also at that point, maybe change or tweak the place that this episode has in the TR story. Mm-hmm. So from there, it was just a matter of, sort of diving in and seeing, well, how can I expand on and tell a slightly different version of this story?
Well, your title, The Crowded Hour, Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and the Dawn of the American Century. Could you talk about the terms crowded hour and American century?
Yeah, so the crowded hour comes from a poem that was a favorite of Roosevelt's, and he called the charge up Kettle Hill and San Juan Hill that day his crowded hour. And I thought, well, okay, well that really fits with part of what I'm trying to say here, because one of the themes in the book, and I really only realized this after I wrote it, was that I was making the argument that this episode was integral to the evolution of Theodore Roosevelt as a leader. And when you think about it, up until this point, he hadn't really been a leader. There were certain points where you could say, well, he had his ranch, or, he was a politician, or, he was in the Department of the Navy, but they weren't really leadership jobs. And they weren't really points where he distinguished himself. Maybe his police commissioner role. But here, you could really start to see those elements that when we think of TR as a leader, as a president, one of our great leaders in American history, you can see those themes come out. And you could make the argument that he really honed those. He really brought all these strings of his personality together, and then that became kind of the basis for his leadership as governor and then as president. And so for me, the crowded hour becomes this kind of metaphor or extended metaphor for this crucible, I guess you'd say, this cauldron in which Theodore Roosevelt as a leader was cooked, so to speak. Yeah. But I also wanted it to reflect on the other theme of the book, which is, we often, and at the time, sort of dismiss the Spanish-American War as this, splendid little war. It was this little thing that happened, and most people don't even learn about it in school, and yada, yada. And I actually thought, well, no, actually, it's a really important period, really important conflict, even though it's a small war by comparison, certainly small compared to what happened in the 20th century. It was critical. It was the first conflict for the United States since the Civil War, and it came at the end of a real period of isolationism by the United States, and an isolationism that was brought about by a pacifism, a turn against war, a turn against anything that would force us back into something that like what we experienced during the Civil War. But a new generation was rising, and they have a different view, not just of war, but of America's role in the world. And by the time of the Spanish-American War, America was growing rapidly. And it was very obvious that this was a country that was going to have an immense impact on the world. It was unclear what that impact would be. Would it be another European power, or similar to a European power, a colonial power? Would it be a force for an expression of pure power interests worldwide? There was a growing interest or awareness in the United States that this was the case, and a real argument, and Theodore Roosevelt made this as well, that the United States could be a force for good in the world. And that, yes, we needed to be out there. Yes, we needed to be involved in world affairs, but we need to do it in an American sense. We need to be doing it as a way of bringing our conceptions of liberty and freedom and individual rights and democracy to the rest of the world. And so much of, I think, what came out of the Spanish-American War was that conviction. Now, America didn't suddenly become an internationalist nation, and one could argue, well, look, the American century didn't really begin until after World War II. But what I want to argue in the book, or what I do argue in the book, is that the seeds of that, the dawn, was planted in the Spanish-American War. So much of the rhetoric around the war, in terms of what the public heard, was around liberty and around human rights and around stopping the genocide of the Cubans. I mean, this was a humanitarian intervention for millions of Americans. That's what was going on. And it was fundamentally what McKinley wanted when McKinley decided to go to war. That was his motivation. There were other reasons, obviously, but for me, what really struck me, and I think what often gets overlooked, is that America went into the Spanish-American War with a set of ideals, and you can argue whether those ideals were cover for something else or, honestly felt, whatever, but they were there, and in a way that it had never happened before, not just in American history, but very rarely in world history. And yet, when we look at the history of America and the world in the 20th century, so many of our interventions abroad come with this same set of ideals. And so for me, the crowded hour becomes this term that defines not just where Theodore Roosevelt changed, but where the country changed dramatically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I like the concept of that, about America, and a turning point for America, too. And obviously the term American century is going to come in much later, as you said, at World War II. But so we talk a little bit more about those forces that were at work in America leading up to the Spanish-American War. And there were people like Roosevelt who were almost spoiling for a fight when they saw this dying Spanish Empire right off the American coastline.
Yeah, it's one of these things where the war almost had to happen because of all of these things. And you say, well, what caused the Spanish-American War? To say that it was the sinking of the Maine or it was one thing is, I think, reductive. It was a ton of things. the interests aligned in favor of the war were multitudes. And like you said, there were jingoes, of which Roosevelt was one, who just were antsy to fight and saw militarism as being integral to, or at least a dose of militarism, to being integral to manhood, to being a patriotic American. That, I think what really, one way to look at it is you have a generation coming out of the Civil War that they didn't use this term, but the generation had PTSD and really reacted against the idea of ever, not just of ever going to war, but even having a military. We had a tiny military. Our Navy was better than the Army, but even our Navy was tiny even in Western Hemispheric standards. Chile had a bigger Navy. And our Army was nothing. Even though we had some good officers, the Army was tiny. And this was by rule. I mean, there was legislation in Congress multiple times during that last 30, 40 years of the 19th century, legislation to get rid of the Army completely. And it never happened, but that was the sentiment. And then you have this younger generation who grew up on stories of the war, but this is just going back to the Greeks. The stories of war are always romanticized, and it's human nature to weed out in your mind the bad parts. And so you hear about the glory and you hear about the adventure. You don't hear about the death and dismemberment and tragedy. And so I think there's just that generational conflict going on at the end of the 19th century, where you have people like Roosevelt who, we can talk about his own psychodrama with his father and what he did or didn't do during the Civil War, and Roosevelt wanting to make up for that. But I think it's more important to see how he reflected an entire generation of people. And so many of those guys, that's why I think so many men rushed into the regiment, because they saw Roosevelt as not just someone to follow, but also someone who is leading a life and leading a charge that they wanted to be a part of, that it activated this sense of righteous adventure. So there's that going on. The labor, you can pick almost any part of American society and find pro-war sentiments. Labor unrest in the United States was a big deal. It was, verging on anarchy in some places, and certainly radicals were upending through strikes or through violent protest were upending society and across the country. And so business leaders, or let's say civic leaders, people saw war as a way to assuage some of that, right? To give vent to people's animosity over unfair labor conditions. You can find it in religion. You mentioned Spain. America defined itself as a Protestant country, and there was no end of anti-Catholic sentiment in the United States, especially then. And Spain was very much a Catholic country at the time, and still is, but at the time was very much that. And there was a racial element in the sense that African Americans in this country understood that there were a lot of people of African descent in Cuba who were fighting for their freedom, and so they saw this as a fight for the freedom of people of color, and so they sympathized with what was going on. You can just run down the list and find groups, whatever the social grouping was, there was support for the war. One place where there wasn't as much support for the war, at least initially, that often I think people get wrong, is there wasn't a lot of business interest in the war. Obviously there were people who were invested in Cuba, and there were people who wanted there to be sort of peace so that we could go in and take advantage of agriculture and mining. There was certainly that, but the business world was very happy without a large army, without a commitment to war. Business pacifism was sort of the ethos of the day, Andrew Carnegie famously founded the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And he meant that very seriously. And the idea that that was good for business. If we could have international peace, it'd be good for business. Sure, of course.
Business of America is business. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so, a lot of people on Wall Street were wary of the idea of going to war because it would mean not only a short-term disruption, but also maybe justify a big military, justify future wars. This was not on the table. Now, once people saw that the war was not necessarily going to be those things, it was fairly short-term, fairly low-cost, and that it opened up Cuba, of course, then people were very happy to rush in and take advantage of Cuba. But the story is more complicated than is sometimes told.
Mm-hmm. Well, as a journalist and an editor for the New York Times, you have a unique vantage point where you can analyze the press coverage of that war. What role do you think the media played in the lead up to the Spanish-American War and even Americans' perception of the war as it progressed?
Yeah, I think, it's certainly true that the media played a large role. I think here, too, there's a little bit of a stereotype and a reductive misconception, because we hear about the yellow press all the time, right? Which was a fair characterization. There were a lot of newspapers out there that liked to take the truth, a kernel of truth, and just run with it as far as they could go, and really get hyperbolic about the news of the day. But what they did, I think, was much more reflective of where the country was, and they underlined and exacerbated sentiments that were already there. They were pro-war, but I think they were more kind of reflecting what the public wanted to hear rather than making the public, an otherwise anti-war public, pro-war. Mm-hmm. I think they were picking up on all these things that I mentioned in terms of currents in American society and saying, well, the war kind of fits that. Now, I think they were also, I don't want to make, these are press barons, they're not, morally upstanding members of society necessarily, but, I think they were also reflecting a certain amount of uproar of moral righteousness over what was going on. They really did see the genocide of Cubans, and it really was a genocide of Cubans, as being a moral cause to stand up for. Now, that was also reflecting the work of Cuban dissidents who had traveled all over the U.S., fomenting interest in the Cuban cause. And I think the point to take away is that this was not a war that was made up by the press, or a justification for the war that was made up by the press. It was a justification that drew on real and substantial sentiments out there among the public, that drew on, I think, a real sense of Christian moralism for the downtrodden people of Cuba. And yes, and then some people, did take that and run with it, whether they were Cuban dissidents or the press. But I think it just, the story has to be seen a little differently. The other thing I'd say is that it wasn't only the yellow press that was pushing this. You had journalists like Richard Harding Davis, who was not just a famous journalist at the time, but really one of the first great war correspondents. And you can read him today, and his work is as fresh and insightful, and it's amazing how well it stands up, at least as far as the way he wrote. And, he was someone who was very skeptical of the war, or of going into the conflict, of U.S. intervention. But he went to Cuba, and he spent time traveling around the island, and he came back very much pro-intervention. And he was not a yellow press guy. He would write for them sometimes, but he hated the yellow press. And so, nevertheless, on this point, he agreed with them. So, I think you need to see all sides.
Yeah. Kind of became a born-again jingo
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
And would really be considered, I guess, what we would call like an embedded reporter with the Rough Riders, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well, that's the other thing is that he, having given him a lot of praise, I should also say that he then became, to some extent, captured by Roosevelt's charms and, was not above... I mean, he actually fought in the first he picked up a gun and was fighting, which, today we certainly look at that and say, well, that's not what reporters should do. At the time, at the moment, I'm not going to judge him too harshly, but he certainly had no problem writing lovely prose about Roosevelt and, very much in his favor. Now, look, I'm not going to judge him. I think it probably would have been pretty cool to be there and watch Roosevelt.
Oh,
yeah. And, I don't have any reason to doubt that Roosevelt was quite an impressive figure during the campaign, but Davis didn't hide his bias. So
a lot of these reporters, whether it's Harding Davis or even Edward Marshall, and then you've got Frederick Remington actually creating the illustrations for this, and so could you talk a little bit about this mythology of the Rough Rider Regiment? You write that Roosevelt and the Rough Riders were everything to everyone. And so how this regiment, they are one of 24 regiments in Cuba fighting, and yet they get the lion's share of the coverage.
So I think this is another reason why given sort of my starting point, why I found the Rough Riders so compelling. Because the country found the Rough Riders so compelling. And it wasn't just that they were famous. And Roosevelt wasn't he was the most famous maybe, but he wasn't the only famous guy. The two of the top tennis players in the country quit tennis to go join the Rough Riders. And it's like, and then you had the types who were famous, these East Coast elites. And then archetypes, miners and police officers and cowboys. And taken together, they reflect American society. And that was Roosevelt's take from the beginning. That was sort of his spin. Davis picked up on that very much, but others did as well. And, they represented this idea of America coming together to fight for good. And this is where I think why the Rough Riders... it's not just the Spanish-American War. I argue in the book that it's the Rough Riders themselves who encapsulate this idea of what America is supposed to represent for the world. It is now, we look at them and say, well, look, it's almost all white guys. It's not that diverse a group. But at the time, it was it was fairly diverse. And Roosevelt and guys like Davis promoted this idea that it was this representation of diverse America, right? And certainly it draws from all over the country and all this. So there's a case to be made. And so it's this Rooseveltian vision of America, right? All these guys, they come from all walks of life. They join in this common endeavor to go out and make the world a better place. And isn't that what how America defined itself during the 20th century? And it's not force for good in the world, but it was encapsulated at this moment after so many decades of not doing that, of turning inward. Suddenly here's this group that is as America as you can get, going out there. And my point, and I spend a lot of time at the end of the book on this, is that Americans understood that. This wasn't something that was made up much later or that Roosevelt wrote about at the end of his life. This was how they were received. I found these sermons of preachers talking about the Rough Riders as this archetype of American goodness. I'm not, I think call it mythology or whatever. I think it's accurate. I think that is what they did represent, that kind of ideal. And the other thing, argument that I make in the book, and this is more on the military history side, is that, the 19th century in America, as far as America's approach to having a military, was this conflict between, I sort of reduce it down to this, but sort of a Hamiltonian vision of having, a standing army, well invested, that America invests in an army that keeps the peace, guards the borders, is a part of American society, and kind of a Jacksonian vision that is skeptical of a standing army and believes that at any given moment we can build an army, right? And that's what happened in the Mexican-American War. It's happened in the Civil War. It's what happened in the Spanish-American War. We have a little tiny kernel of a standing army, and then we blow it out. And in a way, the Spanish-American War both showed that was no longer really a viable way to operate in modern warfare, but it also pointed a way forward. And I think, the Rough Riders help with that transition. Another underappreciated aspect of the Spanish-American War is that how many military reforms came out of it. And if we talk about the 19th century army looking like, this one way, it's after the Spanish-American War that it starts to look really like the army we have today, more and more, pointed in that direction. And so, again, this is a really important turning point for another part of American society.
Mm-hmm. In TR's own book, The Rough Riders, he said that countless volumes could be written about the amazing and varied lives of the men in the regiment. I mean, you have everything from, as you said, like a cross-section of America. There were even members of Native American tribes from the Cherokee, the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Pawnee, including the William Pollock, the Pawnee who wrote and did drawings in TR's letters. Could you talk some more about some of the men that you think typify these stories in the regiment?
Yeah, I mean, I think Pollock is a great example. Being very much not just a Westerner, but being, a Native American. Luna, Maximilian Luna, someone of Mexican heritage, someone, who was motivated to join the regiment in part because he wanted to justify his American bona fides and his family's, right? And to say, no, we are American. We are not, yes, we are Latino, but we're not Spanish, right? We are American. Mm-hmm. And that made a difference for a lot of people to see a guy like him fighting. On the very opposite of that, all of that, you have a guy like Theodore Miller. And, he's someone that I talk a lot about in part because he left a diary. And the diary speaks to this urge that he had, that his generation had. His father had avoided the Civil War because he was a little old, even at the time, but his uncles had found the way into the establishment. And he gave it all up or at least, he thought he was giving it up for a little while. He ends up dying in the conflict. But, he raced to, and this is one of the really fun parts about his diary is he joined late. One of his cousins was already in the regiment, and so he was getting clues about, okay, well, come out to San Antonio. Well, by the time he gets halfway there, he finds out, they've left San Antonio. Then he has to turn around, start chasing him down. Finally meets up with them in New Orleans and is able to join the regiment and sort of get caught up. He adored Bill Larned, who was one of the tennis players, and I gather from his diary is one of the joys of his life. He got to be really good friends with. I mean, imagine that if today you go off to you adore some NBA player, you go off to join a regiment, you get that this NBA player is in, and then you become really good friends with this NBA player. I mean, that's what this was about, and he was also really good friends with Frank Knox, who not only fought in the regiment, took care of Miller as he was sick, and then after his death, went on to become Secretary of the Navy for for Franklin Roosevelt. And so, there's just all this cross section, and it's really, I think a fair claim that this was and certainly more than some of the other regiments that were out there that were, the way it worked was, they were drawn from their states, from their communities, and so reflected fairly local slices of American life, the Rough Riders were national in scope, and that was a new thing.
Yeah. And Roosevelt was always so proud to tout, that this was an American regiment that typified the whole continent. But it was also this reflection of his own life, having spent time out in the West. There were New York City cops. There are, all the swells from the social clubs and the Ivy League colleges. It's just, it's like the regiment is just Roosevelt looking in the mirror. It's just...
it's like a biography in a way.
Yeah.
So how important then, you can argue, which aspect of Roosevelt's preparation in life propelled him onto the presidency. But clearly, the crowded hour, his Cuban battle experience, launched him into national politics. So could we talk just a little bit about what the war meant then for the rest of Roosevelt's political career?
Well, yeah, I mean, there is the national prominence that he gained, and that's not nothing. It's very important. It's what enabled him to return to New York as, someone who had left New York as, let's say, a controversial character. Certainly had his supporters, had a lot of political enemies, a lot of people who didn't think that he could be a state-level leader. He came back from Cuba, and that had all changed. And the rush to get him into the gubernatorial race, which was already on at that point. I mean, he only had a couple of months to campaign, but immediately put him at the front of the race and made him, maybe not a shoo-in immediately, but, certainly a strong contender and ultimately the victor in that race. And, that performance gave him a stable national platform, right? So that he wasn't just this flash-in-the-pan celebrity, but now he was a governor who had standing. And 2 years later, he gets picked for the vice presidency. And, all along the way, certainly in his 1898 race, he leaned into the Rough Rider mystique as a way to rally voters. And he had Rough Riders come along with him and stand in uniform, and he would talk about them. And, it's a lot of fun to read those speeches because he's obviously very proud of what he'd accomplished. Yeah. But I think on a substantive level, I think there were a couple of things that the war did to help, again, be sort of a crucible for his leadership. And I think certainly just executive experience. He had not had a lot of executive experience, especially in difficult times, right, where are sort of, crux moments. And just learning how to make tough decisions and how to make decisions that ultimately will rally people behind you, even if they're tough. I mean, that's fundamentally what a politician does, but fundamentally what a leader does, right, is get people who might disagree with you to nevertheless understand and follow you because you can at least convince them that you are someone in command, someone who has the interests of everyone at heart, right? Just fundamental stuff. And I think that that's something that he learned in the Rough Riders. Another thing, I think one thing that's really important and I think very important, not overlooked, certainly not his biographies, but I think overlooked maybe in his popular image. TR was great at delegating, and he was, even as much as he had no small amount of ego, he also recognized that there were things he didn't know, and that there were people who knew things better than he did. He was not someone who's going to walk into the White House and say, I don't need an attorney general. I know everything there is to know about the law. Obviously, there were better people than that, than him to do that. And he was very good at finding cabinet secretaries and experts and people that he could bring in to complement his leadership. And that's something that I think you see in his experience with the Rough Riders. One of the things that I think is really, really cool is, first of all, he had the opportunity to become the head of the Rough Riders. He said, no, I think Leonard Wood should do it. He's much better experienced and ready to do this. I'll be his second. But then the amount of time that he spent studying field guides, battle manuals, and then finding the guys in the regiment who were veterans. Alan Capron, for example, where he would say, hey, I was reading last night in this manual, and it says to do this, but I don't know. Would you do it this way? How would you do it? What would you do? How do we do? How? And a lot of that then informed how he led the regiment during the fighting. And so, I think that's really admirable, because at that point he's 38 years old, and certainly, some people by that age are pretty stuck in their ways. But here he is learning and absorbing, and then turning that around and applying it immediately as a leader. And I think that's, and while at the same time saying, okay, there are still things that I don't know. The other thing that I think is really, we talk about the battles a lot. Of certain Las Guasimas and the Battle of San Juan Hill, but I think what was really important for Roosevelt as a leader was the siege that came afterward, which is humdrum and not the most exciting period to read about necessarily, but so much, so many of the men who died in that campaign died of disease and malnutrition during the siege, and yet the Rough Riders came away worn down, but better off than a lot of them because of Roosevelt. Because Roosevelt had an exercise regimen. Because Roosevelt kept them out of the field hospitals. Because he made sure they had good food. All of these things contributed, and making sure that they rotated off the line. All these things that I think today you would expect out of a military leader, but at the time, not everybody was doing it that way. And Roosevelt took very good care to administer his portion of the siege. And again, I think that's just good leadership. Take care of your men.
That's a really excellent point. What we might even describe as servant leadership today, where he
exactly
understands. I think you're absolutely right. The devotion of the regiment, particularly, was formed in those few weeks during the siege, where they're down literally sharing the trenches together. That's
absolutely
excellent point.
You see it throughout history with leaders that men would follow anywhere are men like Theodore Roosevelt, who cared for the men, took care of them, had the responsibility and kept the chain of command, but cared for the men.
Yeah, even in San Antonio, one of the things that he would tell the men is, I am not going to hesitate to risk your lives. And some of you are going to die as a result of my decisions. But I will be right there with you. And I will never do something that protects me and harms you. I mean, he said it in a much more eloquent way. And that's easy to say, but he that's what he did.
Yeah.
And the men saw that. And I don't think you can do anything more. I mean, that's the I think the ideal of that servant leadership.
Yeah.
Right? And the men saw it. And, loved him for it.
Said, I'll spill your blood like water.
That's right.
I'll be right there with you.
Yeah, exactly.
And they just loved him for it.
Yeah.
So, you also write that it was only after his time in Cuba that this strenuous life themes that we see really for the rest of his life, self-sacrifice, national honor, the American virility and manhood, that they all congealed into this coherent philosophy, but it was backed by the confident sense of moral superiority that came with having risked his own life for his beliefs. That's a great line.
Oh, yeah. No, it's interesting to contrast his writing in the years leading up to the Spanish-American War to his writing afterward. And he was a great writer. There are few people, Winston Churchill, Lincoln certainly wrote great speeches. There aren't many people who were as fluid and prolific as Theodore Roosevelt. But, some of the stuff he wrote before he went to war was, very much informed by that kind of naive, jingoistic, he had never fought. And I do admire him for, among other things, for saying, look, I talk a big game. And if I'm going to be this guy, I have to go to war. If I'm going to call for war, I have to go to war. And he came back informed by that experience and informed by what it meant to see men killed, to kill people, to lose friends, to go through those extremes. And it's not that he certainly didn't become a pacifist, and his thinking kept evolving, but it's striking how different a writer he was on issues about this after the war.
I've read a lot of his condolence letters to the families of the Rough Riders who died, and they're all filled with the same sentiment of how proud you must be to have laid your son as a sacrifice in the altar of this righteous cause, and that sort of language. So,
and he meant it.
He even used that language after Quinton's death, when he spoke to the Saratoga Republican Convention about the sacrifice of the young men. So,
is that wow?
And in your book, you quote Gail Biederman that through his war experience, TR became a walking advertisement for the imperialistic manhood he desired for the American race.
Yeah.
What do you think? To what extent did America become an imperialist nation at the turn of the century?
Well, I think like a lot of things about America, we did things in a unique way. So we were not an empire like Europe, and that was very much by design. Americans were very anti-imperial in the sense that we didn't want to control other countries or other territories. It doesn't mean that we didn't want to have influence in the world. And what emerged from the Spanish-American War was sort of a model for how to do that. And actually, a couple of different models, I'd say. You have something like Puerto Rico, where we annex it almost, as directly as possible, right? It's American territory. And no real premise that we're ever going to do anything other than control it. Then we get to Cuba, where we give them their independence pretty quickly, but also always with a thumb, right? Always with a sense that no, we're watching and we will intervene, and we did intervene where we thought things were going wrong. But also we're going to do it with an eye toward good governance and democracy and all that. So, and then a place like the Philippines, where the idea was we didn't want the Philippines. It kind of fell in our laps. But now that we're in control for geopolitical reasons, we can't leave it because the Germans will take it. And so we've got to keep it, and we'll try to improve it. But then we're also, pretty quickly, we get into a pretty awful war of our own, or insurgency. But the idea was eventually we're going to give these set of islands their freedom. And, not exactly a time frame, but, some sense of that's inevitable. And I guess Hawaii is yet another one where we made it a state eventually. So you have all these different models, but in each one of them is a version of imperialism. But I think America was sort of testing out what is the way that we want to go. And, and I don't think Roosevelt was necessarily sure what it meant either. The thing at the heart of it that set us apart, at least in our mind, was that we are imperialists, or whatever you want to call it, for good, right? That there was, and whether that was a cover story or not, I think sometimes it was. These things can exist in combination. America can be both an idealistic nation and also have ulterior motives. And just like people, countries are complex. So, I think there's all of that going on. But I think in terms of what Americans saw as maybe the way forward, they saw it embodied in Roosevelt and the way that he talked about the world.
Yeah, you talked about how does America perceive its new role in the world. It's more of a righteous cause. That we felt like these nations that have fallen into our laps, they're not ready for self-government. So we have to stay and uplift and Christianize and civilize. Can you think of an example of how we've seen that play out again since the Spanish-American War?
Yeah, I mean, Vietnam is clearly a great example. It's striking. This was for another project, not a book, but a journalistic project. But I was going back through, early, say in the, 1963, 64, 65. This was before the draft. really took into effect. So you had a lot of guys going to Vietnam as volunteers. Certainly the Marines. It's particularly interesting to look at the Marines because these are all volunteers, right? You didn't get drafted into the Marines. And so many of the early enlistees spoke of a Kennedy-esque vision for the world, going to Vietnam to help the Vietnamese, to check the communists. You know, this is obviously what the government always talked about, but it was real. People really believed that and really felt that that was our obligation as citizens to go help the world, right? Even in a military sense. You know, these were not people going off to, help build schools in sub-Saharan Africa. These were soldiers. So, I think that's an example. I think I think a big justification for going into Iraq, yes, it was weapons of mass destruction, but it was also Saddam Hussein is a brutal genocidal maniac, and we need to save the Kurds. We need to save the Iraqi people. That was a strong theme there. Again, the reasons why all these things happen are complex, but, like World War II, we sort of backed into World War II. It was not something that Americans wanted, but very quickly, once we became involved in it, the sentiment turned around, and it was about, defeating Hitler, defeating the Japanese. These are, genocidal, totalitarian governments, and we are obligated as Americans to go stop them and defeat them. And by the end of the war, it became not just the reason why we're at war, but almost, very much the reason for America in the world. And we saw that germ of an idea that started with the Spanish-American War become the raison d'etre of American foreign policy by the end of World War II. And so, it's not just in wars, but in all kinds of, political interventions throughout history. You see that same gloss of idealism.
Would Twain say history doesn't repeat itself, but it sure rhymes?
It sure rhymes. Yeah, it absolutely does.
Yes.
Clay, we have so appreciated your time and
Yes.
Oh man, this is a lot of fun. I'm really honored to be on here.
Yeah, great discussion about American history, the crowded hour, Theodore Roosevelt, the Rough Riders, and the dawn of the American century. Thanks so much, Clay.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you guys.
Well, that's our show for today. Thanks for listening.
Remember, you can find this podcast on our website, www.talkaboutteddy.com. You can also see our show notes and links to TR resources and books that were mentioned in the podcast.
And if you've enjoyed our content, please do consider subscribing and reviewing the podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and family about us, because it really does make a difference and it helps others find this show.
And if you feel like supporting us, you can now go to buymeacoffee.com/talkaboutteddy.
Or simply click on the yellow coffee cup icon on our website, talkaboutteddy.com.
So we hope you'll join us for the next episode of Talk About Teddy. And as our dear friend Colonel Roosevelt would say,
do what you can with what you've got where you are.
Bully!